Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, bringing you the best in discussion, debate, and analysis on a regular basis for college football. We bring in Steve Merrill each and every week to break down the betting lines. You can join Steve on prosportsinfo.com. Steve, let's see. Well, let's start on a Thursday night. We've got a key matchup in the ACC, a coastal division that's a bit of a mess right now with no clear favorite, although Miami would seem to be the team to beat. Virginia Tech is actually the team with no conference losses as a field goal favorite right now against Georgia Tech.
Yeah, Virginia Tech 4-2 on the season. The terrible loss against Old Dominion is a 28-point road favorite, a month ago. As you said, though, they still control their own destiny to the title game at least, which I guess is what's kept them focused. Another lackluster win last week against North Carolina. And this is a team that's been up and down this season. The key, of course, when you're facing Georgia Tech is having extra preparation time. And the fact that they had the bye week gives them 11 days off since that North Carolina game a week earlier. And I think that's a substantial handicapping factor. Their pass defense has also been their biggest weakness this year. Run defense has been average, but I like the fact they have the extra time to prepare. And they also have a revenge motive. They lost 28-22 last year as a 3-point road favorite. I think it's a better setup this year on Thursday night.
So for anybody who's not familiar as well and just looks at the scores, Virginia Tech was very much in jeopardy against North Carolina. North Carolina had a lead late in the game, and they had the ball at the 1-yard line. They fumbled going in for a 2-score lead with like 3 or 4 minutes left in the game, and Virginia Tech took it down for the winning score. All right, another key matchup. Actually, before we move to Friday, let's stay on Thursday because we've got a Baylor team, Steve, that we saw go to Texas. Can't remember exactly where that game was. Anyway, they played Texas, and they were throwing the ball in the end zone to win the game. Lost by 6, couldn't convert, but still that close against Texas. Now facing a West Virginia team that hasn't played the big boys in the Big 12 yet, but was tripped up by Iowa State.
Yeah, I actually really liked Iowa State in that game a few weeks ago. I had a strong best bet for my clients on Iowa State. It was plus 6.5 when I released it. Went all the way down to 4.5 by kickoff on Saturday. There was a ton of sharp money on Iowa State, including my clients as well a couple weeks ago. So I wasn't surprised by that loss. I thought West Virginia was a bit of a phony 5-0 team going into that game. By the way, Virginia Tech, was coming off that Notre Dame loss. I think they definitely were a little bit flat in that North Carolina game. And the reason I bring that up is because West Virginia does have the advantage of having a bye after losing that game against Iowa State, their first loss of the season. Teams historically that start 5-0 or better and then lose a game have been about a 60% play against in their following game. But as I've mentioned in previous weeks, I don't think that angle works quite as well now because a lot of these one-loss teams like LSU, for example, they know they're still alive in the playoff race. I'm not sure that's the case with West Virginia, but they do probably control their own destiny still as far as making the Big 12 title game. All they have to do is finish in the top 2. With that said, though, I'm not even sure a one-loss Big 12 team is going to get in, but they probably have a good shot still with one loss, and I think they'll stay focused for this one. Baylor, just not sure they have enough to keep this one close. Spread is currently 14. They have some good offense, 32 points a game, 33 points a game. It's that defense. I just don't see them slowing down West Virginia. Should be a high-scoring shootout.
Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. Please join him there, prosportsinfo.com, not just for college football, but the NFL, Major League Baseball World Series, of course, starting on Tuesday night, and the NBA is in full swing at this point. Big Friday night matchup, not in regards to the college football playoff, but also a matchup that I think a number of us keyed on during the offseason, projecting a Clemson-Miami ACC championship game, that this could be a tricky one for the Canes, and we expected them to be a much more stable situation at this point in the season, but they're going to Boston College, where it's going to be a bit frigid on a Friday night against an Eagles team that is capable.
Yeah, check the weather this time of year because this is a Miami team that's not used to cold weather, and being a Friday night game up in the Northeast, will get a bit chilly. I think that actually could be a factor here. Also, keep an eye on the weather. They're calling for a lot of rain on the East Coast on Saturday, Friday night, and Saturday during the daytime, which could affect some of these college football games as well as we get closer to the weekend. Miami of Florida, I thought, was a bit of an overrated 10-win team coming into the season from last year. Their loss against LSU did not look good at the time, although LSU's been a pretty good team this year. They were lucky to beat Florida State a few weeks ago, and then they bounced back and lose outright to Virginia last week as a 7-point favorite. So it does appear they are an overrated team, as I suspected. Haven't really had any opportunities to take advantage, unfortunately. Boston College, meanwhile, was probably an underrated team. They actually cracked the top 25 last month. As is often the case, teams come back down to earth after doing that. They're just 2-2 straight up their last 4. But this is a big Friday night national TV game for them as a home dog. I think they're definitely a live home dog here, especially if Miami's a bit hungover still after that Virginia loss.
Steve, we've got an interesting situation with Virginia. They control their own destiny to get to an ACC championship game. And we're making this statement not deep into the season, but it is late October. So Virginia is taking care of business at this point. And of course, they're coming off a couple big wins, in particular against Miami. Now, for the first time against not necessarily a decent opponent, but at least a Power 5 ACC opponent, they're in the unfamiliar position of being a heavy favorite, a 9-point play against North Carolina in Charlottesville.
Yeah, here's how crazy North Carolina's demise has been the last couple of years. 2 years ago, these teams played in Charlottesville. North Carolina was a 10.5-point favorite. Now they're a 9-point dog. That's almost a 3-touchdown difference in just 2 seasons. Even last year, we saw it as Virginia closes a 3-point road favorite in their 2014 road win. So even last year was a 2-touchdown adjustment already within 1 season. Now it's a 3-touchdown adjustment because Virginia has gotten even better. And as you mentioned earlier, North Carolina really blew that game against Virginia Tech. Normally you see a letdown after that, but they actually did not let down. They played Syracuse extremely tough last week into overtime, lost by 3. So I guess the question now, Mark, becomes, do they have a hangover after back-to-back 3-point losses? They could have won both those games. They did cover against the spread, but they went 0-2 straight up, which is all they care about, obviously. But then again, do you worry about Virginia having a letdown? They go from being a touchdown road underdog, winning outright against Miami, to now being a 9-point favorite. And don't forget, they just beat Duke also as a touchdown dog. So the back-to-back big wins, you have to be worried about a letdown spot for both teams here. When in doubt, I usually lean towards the underdog for that reason.
Steve Merrill joining us from ProSportsInfo.com. Steve, I'm intrigued by the Big Ten Western Division race. Wisconsin was the odds-on favorite, just the heavy favorite all preseason. A few people liked Iowa to possibly challenge them. It's wide open right now. We have 3 games this week that will factor heavily into the division championship. So we start with Wisconsin at Northwestern. The Badgers a 6.5-point play.
Yeah, by the way, updated Big Ten odds right now. We've got Michigan even money, Ohio State 3-2, 1.5-1 basically, and then Iowa and Wisconsin both 8-1, and then Northwestern 15-1. So that's what you're looking at right now. Michigan's in the driver's seat. Wisconsin is still in it based on the fact they are in a much weaker division, obviously. I think they could be a play-on team here at this point. Northwestern's a scrappy squad. What I don't like about Wisconsin is laying the big numbers sometimes. We saw that bad loss against BYU last month as a 23-point favorite. They have gone 3-1 straight up since. I like the fact they bounced back with the strong showing off that Michigan loss and beat Illinois by 29 last week. Northwestern, meanwhile, off of 3 straight wins in a row. Have to wonder if we see a little bit of a regression. This is still the worst rushing attack maybe in college football. They're averaging just 78 yards a game, just 2.3 yards per carry. They won a game against Michigan State with 8 rushing yards on 20 carries. I'm just not sure you can sustain that, especially against a great rushing attack like Wisconsin. You know, Mark, in general, if you could tell me a team that's going to outrush their opponent like on a 2-to-1 ratio, you probably cover 80-85% of the time. That's almost a certainty in this game. Wisconsin, 282 yards per game on the ground. Northwestern 78 yards. So it's hard to imagine they're not going to have a huge rushing edge in this one.
Yeah, the story there is that Jeremy Larkin, filling in for Justin Jackson, who moved on to the NFL, was a fine back, had to retire after 4 or 5 games due to a neck or spinal injury, and they haven't been able to fill in for him, and they pretty much just gave up on running the ball, in particular against the Michigan State. I watched a lot of that game. They just threw the ball every play practically, and last week had a 100-yard rusher against Rutgers, but that was against Rutgers, and the Wildcats only won that game 18-15. So 2 other games that factor in heavily. Of course, Purdue, as high can be, beating number 2 at home in a rout. They go to Michigan State. Considering the expectations preseason, Michigan State, rather disappointing. Obviously, a 2-2 in the Big Ten. So we've got Michigan State as a slight 2-point favorite at home against Purdue.
Yeah, and I think both these teams, you have to trust their mindset is obviously a very big question mark here. Michigan State, of course, because they lost that huge game against Michigan. And then, of course, as you said, Purdue, because they're coming off the big win. I think in general, letdowns happen more in college football off of tough losses. So that Michigan loss could be a bit of a hangover for Michigan State. But I really worry about Purdue here. Off of 4 straight wins, 5 straight covers, and now they're taken to the road after that Ohio State upset. Dangerous spot for both teams this week. Michigan State's offense, once again, is a concern. Purdue's defense is more their concern. So I think when in doubt with the mindset of both teams, I'd rather have the better defensive team, which appears to be Michigan State in this game.
Interesting situation here with the other team that can factor into the Big Ten Western Division. That's, of course, the Hawkeyes going to Penn State. Both they and Wisconsin have to go to Happy Valley, which isn't as daunting as we thought it might have been. But still, Iowa taking on a capable Penn State team that's about a 6 or 6.5 point favorite.
Yeah, for me, it's all about the mindset of Penn State. I mean, if you look at their statistics, they're a very solid team on both sides of the ball. They're averaging 6.8 yards per play. They're allowing just 4.9. They're outgaining their opponents by almost 2 yards per play. That usually is a top 5 or top 10 team statistically in the country. Last week, a non-cover, lackluster 33-28 win against Indiana. Really no shame there. After back-to-back losses to Ohio State and Michigan State, to even win that game last week was probably tough. The question is, do they reset? Do they start to play up to that top 10 caliber, which I really think this team is? Iowa, meanwhile, great defensive team. They're giving up just 14 points a game. I think it could be a lower scoring game than expected. Iowa's going to have a low scoring game here. They don't want to get in a shootout. And with a total around 54 right now, if you like Iowa and this one is a 6.5 point dog, you probably lean towards the under as well.
All right, Steve, we also have two other games that we have to hit on. Clemson-Florida State, an annual battle typically for the ACC. Obviously, the Seminoles not up to that kind of challenge this year. You were right, definitely, about the North Carolina State-Clemson matchup, which on the surface was, okay, undefeated versus undefeated, top two teams in the Atlantic Division. And Clemson, I'm not surprised that they covered 17 points. What I'm surprised is in the manner that they did. Like, it wasn't like a 7-point lead at half, then it stretched out a little bit, and it was competitive, and then they finally won 28-10. They put down the throttle from the opening series, and it was just 3-and-out, 3-and-out, 3-and-out for NC State, and Clemson was just scoring touchdowns, and it was just an annihilation. And now they traveled to Tallahassee to take on Florida State. From a talent perspective, the teams are fairly even, but obviously in different levels of play right now in terms of where the programs are. And Clemson back to being a 17-point favorite.
Yeah, and I mentioned last week, one of the reasons I like Clemson in that game was because my power ratings made the line 23. And when we did the segment on Tuesday, it was 16.5. And by that Friday, Saturday, it was up to 17.5. So apparently some sharp money agreed with me that line was too short. And the other thing I pointed out about that game was that the key to handicapping these big 2-3 touchdown favorites or more is motivation. And they had plenty of motivation. Yes, NC State had played them within 7 each year. They could play with them, obviously, but I also think that focused Clemson more. You wouldn't think normally there'd be a letdown when facing Florida State, but Florida State's been so weak the last couple seasons that Clemson might come back down to earth a bit. That might have been the big game last week. Who would have thought NC State would be a bigger game than Florida State for Clemson's focus? Meanwhile, Florida State is starting to turn things around. They got off to that bad, slow start against Wake. I attribute some of that maybe to the hangover after blowing the Miami of Florida game. Again, they definitely could have won, should have won. They had the bye week, came out a little flat, as teams often do, turned it on in a nice 21-point win. So maybe that was the buy sign we've been looking for with Florida State. They've now played 2 straight games in a row, which they've covered after going just 1-4 against the spread. And defensively, Mark, this team has been pretty good this year. They're allowing just 4.7 yards per play against opponents that average 5.5. Offensively has been the problem. They're a below-average offensive team. So once again, they cannot afford to get in a shootout against Clemson. It's hard to imagine they're going to move the ball very well against that great Clemson D. And if Clemson comes in a little bit hungover after the big win last week, under 51 might be worth a look. I wish the total was a little bit higher. It seems like a short total, but Florida State's offense is not good this year. Their defense is actually probably quietly better than people realize.
And finally, Steve, we've got the big one in the SEC with Georgia taking on Florida. The Bulldogs given a lot of credit for recruiting and talent on the roster. Really, they haven't done anything against anybody capable this year. They've got the one big showdown at LSU and lost by 20 points. Florida actually has a much better resume, having already played Kentucky, although they lost that game. They won at Mississippi State. They won against LSU. So Florida has the results, but Georgia has the reputation, and they're a full touchdown favorite.
Yeah, my power range is actually only favor them by about 4 points. So I do think this line is too high. And obviously, I'm concerned about a potential letdown here off that loss against LSU. But as I mentioned earlier, teams with one loss, especially a team like Georgia, they know they still can somewhat control their destiny to that 14 playoff if they win out. And they also had the bye week. The bye could not have come at a better time than after that bad loss by 20 points at Georgia. So they should be focused here for this one. They beat Florida 42-7 last year as a 13-point favorite. Obviously, Florida more competitive this year. Florida did get them the year before. Hard to imagine. Florida was a touchdown favorite 2 years ago in this game after losing by 35 last year, the year prior. So I do think the Gators are in a better spot here. They've now won 5 straight. That new coaching staff was young when they lost to Kentucky. I came back and used the best bet on Florida the next week against Colorado State for my clients, and they've been a play-on team since. In fact, that Colorado State is the first of 5 straight wins and covers the last 5 games for the Gators. I see no reason to buck that trend. I think, once again, this line is too high and the values with Florida.
There's obviously a number of matchups we could hit on, a number of intriguing plays in the SEC, and an important game for Kentucky, also for a number of teams, Texas, Oklahoma State. Please join Steve at prosportsinfo.com. I'll have my predictions released right here at Mark Rogers TV later in the week. We appreciate you stopping by, Steve.
Thanks, Mark.